So let me just say what we did this morning then was to go through an extended version of the slide sequence about Wittgenstein, in which I tried to draw out more fully the significance of his work for questions of inclusion and exclusion, and how that is, those practices of inclusion and exclusion are internal to our language, because to come into a language is to come to learn how to use an expression, a thought, an idea, in the way that others do. Right? That's absolutely fundamental to our being as human beings. And then that extends into social practices of great complexity, which constitute our worlds. So one example we talked about quite a lot was the practice of taking off your shoes when you go into a house in Japan. And that practice needs to be understood holistically, so it's tied up with notions of inside, outside, cleanness, uncleanness, friendliness, homeliness, and so on. All of those things interrelate with this simple, relatively simple physical practice. And the practice contributes to a construction of what home is and what a sense of belonging is. So that it feels different, or it creates something different from what you'd find in, say, French hospitality or Italian hospitality or American hospitality. Okay? That was the kind of thing we talked about. I don't really want to go through the slide sequence again because we spent some time doing it this morning. So we can use this space this afternoon to follow up ideas that you have that have come up in the course and connections you might want to make. So would you like to start talking Japanese just to see what things are in your mind that you'd like to talk about? You could just make two groups and just share some ideas in Japanese for 5 minutes or so, okay?
I was interested in your last slide in this morning.
Could you put it up?
As you explained, our identity is fluid. So, and you said the fluidity can cause anxiety.
Yeah.
So I want to think whether we endure that kind of anxiety. So, and I want to think about how we relieve this fluidity.
Yes. How we live it.
Sorry.
How we live it.
How we.
How we.
And fluid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I understand about fluidity, but
Yeah,
what's
fluidity.
the question? How do we
relieve?
Oh, relieve.
Relieve.
I see. Yes. Okay. So I think that there are many ways to relieve the fluidity. You can buy fashion magazines, and fashion magazines will tell you how to dress, what style to adopt, what films to see, what records to buy, and so on, well, music to listen to. And you can read certain newspapers that will tell you what to think. They don't encourage discussion or thought, they give you a ready-made point of view. And you can go to teachers who will signal clearly the criteria that will be used in the test, and you make sure that you pass by reproducing those things you've been taught. So all of those things close down thought, and they're very attractive to us because it's easier to do that, and it relieves us of the pressure to think for ourselves. So I think all around us in the culture, in education and in the social world, we're encouraged to do that. And sometimes it serves governments well if people are encouraged to do that as well. somebody was talking to me about Murakami. Was it? Yes. Okay. I haven't read the novel, and we don't know what it's called in English, but you will know it. What is it in Japanese? Yes, YQ 94, 84. Yeah. Okay. In which Murakami talks about not Big Brother, but Little Brother, because Big Brother is not out there telling us what to do. Big Brother has come inside. And Foucault has a concept that's very closely related to this. Foucault talks about governmentality. Do you know this or not? So it's a mentality, in other words, a kind of mind in which we govern ourselves. So it's clever. It works the same in French, gouvernementalité, works the same way, okay? Government, governmentality, a mentality of self-government. But not self-government in a good sense, like autonomy, but self-policing. So you don't need Big Brother, because Little Brother is already inside. What have you had to eat today? Have you had enough vegetables? Have you had too many calories? Have you had too much sugar? I think probably Western people are more preoccupied with this because of weight problems, getting fat and so on. But on the whole, it's difficult just to eat now. Normally we give some thought to whether we have the right combination of nutrients. In a way, that's perfectly sensible because it's more healthy. But the bad side to it is it means we are less able to do things naturally. There is this kind of self-policing that's going on. So if you're a parent and you have children, you don't just have children and enjoy the children. You worry about whether you have the right parenting skills, whether you've given them enough quality time each day. So I'm using cliches here, parenting skills, quality time. That's the way we've come to understand the relationship, the human relationship. Okay, so there are various ways in which we have answers ready-made for us, ways to live our lives, and that makes it easier, I think. And with Facebook you are given a template for constructing an identity. I don't know the terms, but friends, lifeline, what do you call it? Interests, relationships. You don't do it? Aye, right. Okay, I do it, but I have 6 friends, so you can see how often I do it. You don't do it? Have you? But we're not friends. See, so you know the problem with social media, okay? So that's one of the answers, that we're encouraged to accept ready-made profiles or profiles that we can easily fit into and ready-made attitudes. Okay, so I think it's important that this anxiety shouldn't become neurosis. If we're anxious all the time, we can't do anything. But if we're complacent, we simply give in to the ready-made identity or the received point of view. So it's a matter of getting along with the others, taking part in the conversation, but also contributing your voice to the conversation so that it doesn't just stay static and repetitive. What do you think about that? Do you want to say anything?
Yes. answer, but yes, that's all.
Right, okay. Someone over here? Do you want to start, Jeremy?
I was just picking up on Fence's point. So, but my point and Rina's point.
Do you want to say it, Rina?
In the class, we have discussed the relation between our culture and the other culture, or mother tongue and foreign language. And I think that even within one person, there is usually invisible and repressed oneself.
Repressed.
So we don't recognize. And when another oneself is revealed, we have negative emotions. And this is the anxiety of accepting another oneself as oneself. Not by integrating contradictory self, but by remaining it. In the text Nostalgia, the author says one can invent in the place between two languages. And so I think there might be something that we can invent by accepting the division of identity and regarding oneself as being lived in contradiction. So I want to think about this on the basis of idea of reason, recognition, and reverence for the other.
Okay, I missed one word there. You want to think about it on the basis of the idea of
Reason.
reason.
It's on dues.
Oh, reason. I see. Yes. Okay. Sure. All right. That's a superb comment. So you're suggesting that there is a kind of repression very often because we are more divided than we admit. We are less integrated, less whole than we admit. And because we have to present ourselves to others on Facebook or elsewhere, we pretend that we are together. Or when we talk in a group, we pretend that we are together in our views so that we come across as clear characters. And this involves a repression, it's a good word to use, and you think it would be better if we lived without the expectation of a unified self or a fully integrated self, and that we lived in recognition of our own divided or conflicted nature. Okay, yes, that's wonderful because you talked about rhizomes, and that's very relevant. Deleuze, I mean, you know about rhizomes, obviously from the thing you read that I wrote, but also other times I expect. But Deleuze asks at one point for a cogito a cogito for a dissolved self. What does he mean by a cogito? Well, I think you know Descartes, cogito ergo sum. So we use cogito as a shorthand expression for the unified basis of the I thinking thoughts. That's unified, that's me. That's a very powerful notion in modern Western thought, and it comes into notions of individualism, of good mental health, and so on. And it gives us notions that are arborescent, not rhizomatic, but arborescent, isn't it? Tree-like notions, a solid trunk of a tree with branches, and so on. So, but what Deleuze is saying, let's try and get rid of that in favour of a different kind of self, Not the strong unified self, but a dissolved self. One that is weaker in terms of its boundaries, more able to flow, more able to live with contradiction. Yes, that's great, that's great. Anybody want to follow that up?
Yeah.
Go on.
Before this session,
Yes.
we talked with Lina. I talked with Lina about the rhizome and rhizome.
Yes.
Rhizome and the.
Rhizome would be French, so rhizome in English. That's
okay, thank you. Rhizome and the airborne roots.
Yes, great.
In
Airborne
the
roots.
Cassin's
Yes.
text.
Yes.
Yeah, and in the Cassin's text, 62 pages.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. She talks about the culture removed from the land, about the culture removed from the land.
Yes.
And to express such idea of language, she, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 lines from the bottom, 62 pages. When the only patrimony is language, and when we make the profession of it, we can raise it up into the air and praise not uprootedness, but airborne roots. And so, Cassin doesn't admit, Cassin doesn't deny we have the roots, but her idea of roots is airborne roots.
Yes, sure. Yes.
And airborne root is not rooted in the ground
Yes.
and
yes.
Go that way and this way.
Yes.
And that is a kind. I think that is a kind of rhizome.
Okay, that's certainly, that's right. Yes. I am regretting something. I wanted to show you a picture of Spanish moss. Do you have Spanish moss in Sacramento? I think you don't, do you? Too dry.
Florida.
Yeah, sure. So on the east coast of the United States, Georgia and Florida and so on, there is a very beautiful kind of moss that hangs in the trees. I don't think you have it here, but it's light green and it moves through the air. And it is rhizomatic, like grass is rhizomatic and moss is rhizomatic, so it spreads laterally, it clones, there's no central root. And it's a lovely light green colour, and it hangs from the trees, it's very beautiful. So these are literally airborne roots. Have you got a picture?
Yeah. Can you see this? Can you see this? It's not so big, but many cousins.
Thank you.
Moss.
Yes. Now, technically, I understand it's not really moss and it's not really Spanish, but that doesn't matter. It's called Spanish moss.
Spanish moss.
Yes. So it's an excellent thing to bring out. Thank you. And airborne. Why does it have to be airborne? Why is she concerned about it being airborne? So that it's not in the ground.
Yeah.
So it's not Germany, for example.
Yeah.
Yes, or Greece. Okay. Is there any other connection in view of what we've talked about today, perhaps? I'm thinking about something you said earlier on to do with language.
Yeah, and this kind of image is, I think, similar to what you said in the morning session about Wittgenstein's image of Wittgenstein's ways of writing, philosophical integration. That is like now unordered city. Sorry.
Yes, that's right. A city without order.
Yeah, city without
yes,
order.
which is yes, okay. Yeah.
And we walked this way and go back.
Yes.
And finally we find the
Our way. Yeah.
the holistic images.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And I think languages also has such images.
Yes. Yes.
Even Japanese has constituted by, in some sense, in some way, English constituted by English or Germany
Sure.
and Chinese.
Yes.
And it is it looks like the airborne roots.
Yes. Okay.
And that is not rooted in the land of Japan.
Okay, good. That's great. Can you see a further way in which language is literally airborne?
Language is literally.
Language is literally airborne.
What do you mean by
But
that?
born means carried, you know that, with an E on the end. It means air carried. In what way is language literally airborne, air carried? I'm showing you all the time when I'm talking to you. In what sense is my language airborne?
Oh, okay. Alan distinguishes the people and the languages. Sorry.
Not quite, no.
Oh, sorry.
No, you can say it if you want to. I'm not stopping you. Please say if you want to.
Sorry,
It's not.
I think I didn't get your
No, okay.
question.
Anybody?
How in the air?
Yes. Why is the air necessary for there to be language? I'm demonstrating it right now. Breathing.
Ah, yeah, breathing.
Okay, so to speak, I have to put air through past my vocal cords and so on. So the breath and language are actually very closely related.
Yeah.
And even the way language is, quite literally, because language is broken up into words and phrases, and then you run out of breath, so you come to the end of the sentence. Okay, so the structure of our thought relates to the body, the in-out of the body as well.
So you're saying that language is the breath of the life.
Yes, yeah. Something like that. And of course you can have other sign systems. Of course there are people who can't speak, and they use signing and so on. But the fundamental thing is that we say things to one another, and that depends upon the pressure of air. Okay?
Yeah.
Take it in, and now I can speak because I've taken some air in. And it's the controlling of that pressure of air.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Do you want to elaborate, anybody? Or say something related?
Can I ask you what I said to you probably over lunch? The connection between what you discussed this morning about Wittgenstein's view on language and probably the impossibility of communication between different language community, linguistic community, or between the gap between language games and what we discussed in the first part of this course, which is Kassan's idea of nostalgia, translation, and probably the question of the untranslatable, which you may talk.
Yes, okay, that's a nice link through then. So I think on the first day we met, someone made a comment about Wittgenstein, and I suggested that Wittgenstein's writings about Fraser's Golden Bough. So, bough is a branch of a tree, Baum in German, golden bough, okay? And Sir James Fraser wrote a book in, I think, 1919 called The Golden Bough. It's a very big book, and it's one of the earliest books in anthropology in the 20th century at least. And it looks at many different cultures around the world, often at primitive cultures, and looks at their practices. And it's full of interesting examples, but Wittgenstein is critical of it because he thinks that in the end, Fraser is very ethnocentric in his way of looking at these practices. He says that Fraser is like an English priest, an English parson, an English priest who cannot imagine a meaningful culture different from our own. Okay? By contrast, Wittgenstein says that to understand a practice, you need to enter into the way of thinking holistically of that practice, and then you will see parallels between what those people are doing and practices of your own, which you'd become very used to and hadn't seen as strange. So one example is that Fraser considers a practice in Serbia. You know where Serbia is? What used to be Yugoslavia, next door to Greece and Italy, Serbia, okay? And in this culture, if a child was orphaned, if the child lost his parents, then a woman from another family would take the child, put the child under her skirt, lower part of her dress, and then pull the child out from her skirt. And then the child would be her own to look after. So, do you understand that then? The child, you've got a small child, he's lost his parents, and a woman, some other woman, takes the child, puts the child under her skirt, and then pulls the child out. Okay? So it's kind of a ritual enactment of giving birth. And Fraser thinks this is confused. These simple people think this is a magical practice that makes the child their own. But Wittgenstein says no, it's clear, it's a symbolic practice. And there are many symbolic practices in Christianity. And it's obvious what it means. The woman is taking the child as her own. She doesn't really think she's given birth. Obviously she hasn't. But it's a symbol of taking the child as her own. So he takes many examples like that at first seem very strange, but really make sense. So he would say that there are deep things in culture, like all cultures that deal with giving birth, marriage, death, eating, probably sleeping as well. These things that are fundamental to human nature, which always have a cultural particular manifestation. And you can see parallels between them. So that reaches across any assumption of sheer cultural relativism to show these common patterns manifested in different ways. Okay? And you said the untranslatable. I'm trying to think of the best examples here. He does make remarks to the effect that sometimes another people can seem a complete enigma to us. Enigma is mystery. Or another individual can seem a complete mystery to us, even where we share the language. So he acknowledges this experience of strangeness, both interculturally and intraculturally. But he would then say, you can still try to make connection, but sometimes you will reach a point where your spade is turned, where you can't get any further with the people. And you said something about the untranslatable. Taco has kindly copied some pages from Barbara Cassin's huge book. It's 1,400 pages, this book, called Dictionary of Untranslatables. And we're not going to read these in detail, but I'm going to describe them to you briefly. What we've got is two different topics here. And one of them is Bildung, and I think it's on the right-hand side of page 111. And you can see at the beginning of the entry, you can see that the French words are given into which Bildung is often translated. So in particular, formation would be the most common translation of Bildung. If you understand education as a process of Bildung, that's like a process of formation in French, which of course is like formation in English. And then it gives the Greek word paideia and the Latin word cultura as related to these. It's said that it's a very difficult word to translate. Bildung is a difficult word to translate into other languages because it's a very, very central term in German culture. I think it's interesting for you to read this, and I think it will help you in your future research. It seems to me a weakness of this book that it doesn't pay much attention to non-European languages, but perhaps that was just too big a project for her. I'm going to show you the other entry because it's a little bit briefer. If you turn to the next to last sheet. So this is now page 125. And this is an entry on care. And care is a perfectly ordinary, can you see it? It's the next to last sheet, Kensuke. Almost the back. Okay, care is a very ordinary word in English. Kyotsukete, take care, right? That's like that. Or you care for the sick or the elderly. And in German, it has an interesting history because for Heidegger, Sorge becomes a very central term. That's the German equivalent. So that's central to his philosophy. And then in more recent times and closer or within the world of education, Nell Noddings uses the word care in what she calls her care ethics, which is a quite interesting mix, drawing a little bit on Jean-Paul Sartre as well as other more familiar notions. So care ethics. And that's become one of the main ways in which moral education's understood, I would say. So it's worth knowing about care in that sense. What is not mentioned here is, although care ethics is mentioned towards the end of the entry, on the second sheet, I think. Or perhaps at the bottom of the bottom right of 125. So care ethics, in French, they often, when they talk about care ethics, don't talk about le soin or le souci or la sollicitude, those words they give us here. Instead, they talk about le care. So they simply take the English word into French. And you talk about care, don't you? Is that right? Care? Isn't that right?
Care.
You say, okay, you say care in Japanese. Okay. So I'm interested by words that are imported like that. In English, if we're talking about education and someone says, I'm really interested in Bildung, it sounds a bit clever. It sounds sophisticated. It has that sort of aura to it. Do you understand? I'm being clever because I know this complex term and I cannot translate it into English. Just as if I said, I'm really interested in Ikki. Okay? The Japanese spirit of Ikki. That sounds actually very pretentious if I say that, right? And I do want to give you a serious example here in relation to Japanese, because I'm interested by the way that social justice, that phrase, has become so dominant in educational research. I mean, many researchers would say that's their main focus. And so in the international language of educational research, which of course is English, social justice is heard a lot. And in Japanese, you can say shakai seigi, or you can say socialu justice. And it seems quite significant to me that quite often people will prefer socialu justice because it sounds more a part of this international research than the authentic Japanese shakai seigi. So there's a strange kind of, it's not exactly policy borrowing, but there's a sort of import going on there, or is it a colonization? There's something a little bit worrying about that. And I wonder if we could just look briefly at page 47 and 48 of Hannah Arendt. 47 and 48. This is something that I'm very concerned about, and it came up in the discussion on Sunday. We spent quite a long time talking about cliché on Sunday, and then what Cassin does with that notion of cliché is to say that it's not just about familiar phrases that are used. A person can start to speak clichés in everything they say. And to speak clichés is to avoid speaking for yourself. It's to speak a kind of automatic language. And in Arendt's case, she cites the example of Eichmann, who spoke officialese. That's the phrase that I think is used here. about 15 lines down on page 47. Can you see that? Amtssprache in German. Officialese is my only language. And that's something that Eichmann said, apparently. Just here on the page, okay? Just about there. Officialese. Officialese isn't a proper word. It's taken the ending "ese" as in Japanese and put it on the word official. So in other words, Eichmann could only speak a bureaucratic language, a language of management. So my worry would be that educators can only speak a language of learning outcomes and performativity. You see that? And that is a kind of cliche, using her terms. It's a denial of responsibility. It's an avoidance of judgment. And that seems to me very dangerous. Now, I want to couple that point about cliche. Eichmann was, of course, speaking German, but I want to couple this point about cliche and officialese with the dominance of English in educational research and other international language, of course. And so if you go to page 48, 49, at the bottom there she's talking about Globish, right, global English, which if you go to an international research conference is the language that's being spoken to some extent. Because when people speak a language which is not their native language, unless they're very fluent in it, they will be quite competent with technical language, an abstract language, but they will not be able to speak colloquially in it. They will not have that language as a language of intimacy, of friendliness, of naturalness, and so on. So it works at the technical level, but the language at the technical level is cut away from that ordinary participation in the language. Can you see the consequences of this? It means that the language that's being spoken is not a real language at all. It's an artificial language that works with technicalities. And apparently, she says on page 49, that the British Council is doing a lot of work to study this because they are worried about the effects of the dominance of English in the world. Can you see that? Because this kind of slightly technical language may encourage a technical mentality, so that it becomes more difficult to talk about complex matters like education, where the humanities are so important in understanding education. That becomes more difficult, but you can talk about your latest research projects, your quantitative research, the ways in which lessons can be planned more efficiently, and so on. All those things can work, but you can't talk in a more rounded way about the human condition. So my example of Japanese people saying social justice instead of shakai seigi is just a tiny sign of that dominance of this less personal, less deep connection with the language.
And can I add, probably that is why the perspective translation is necessary to resist the tide of monolingualism.
Yeah.
Monolingualism. Yeah. And also coming back to the dominance of English in academia, I think that this division between native speaker and non-native speaker is kind of being destabilized, because even if grammatically speaking, in the morning we talked about the grammar, and even if you speak in the correct grammar, it's not same as you are sort of fluent in expressing your ideas. So sometimes non-native speaker can be more talented than native speakers in expressing their thought in language. So I think that is where sort of distinction between inside and outside, non-native speaker and native speaker, this borderline is being sort of disturbed.
Yes, I agree with you. So I think as I said on Friday, I think we need to be wary of, cautious about, or worried about people who are native English speakers and don't speak other languages. And I include myself, but there are far worse people than me because many people never speak another language at all and have no sense of any importance to any other language. I'm sorry to get at the Americans, but I think it's true that 70% of Americans have never been abroad. So that's quite interesting because probably they could afford to go abroad, but they're not interested. There's no point because everything is in America. And if you live, of course, many parts of the United States are now predominantly Spanish speaking, but if you live in a predominantly English part of the world, then why would you need other languages? And you wouldn't see foreign language programs on television, you wouldn't hear foreign languages in the street, and so on. So that's quite dangerous when people think that they have the final language and that language is sufficient to describe the things of the world and the possibilities for human life. So English speakers can be very insensitive to these things because they're not exposed to other languages. Is that roughly what you... Does that fit with what you said?
We were talking about the monolingualism in Japan, that idea comes up to me because when I hear Kassa's presentation Tuesday, he talks about his experiences, and he is Pakistani, and at the same time he is British.
Yeah.
Yeah, he grew up in the early days. He moved to England in the early day, and so he has two identity.
Yes.
And to identify himself as a Pakistani means to remove his English part. And this is very interesting to me because when I think about what happened in Japanese, when we learned English, we learn English as foreign languages, and we learned Japanese as national languages.
Yes.
Our languages.
Yes.
But our Japanese are already constituted by English and German after Meiji era. But most Japanese teachers learned in university the Japanese literature before Meiji era or the early age of Meiji era. So they are not aware of the influence by the Western.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So to learn Japanese in that way removes my English part or German part, and I come to notice this through the work of translation.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting.
You work of translation, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So translation, something that is not appeared in the translated book appears to me when I compare the English book and Japanese book.
Sure.
Yeah, and what appears is not only what appears is not cannot be expressed only in Japanese, and nor can expressed only in English, and it can only be expressed between English and Japanese.
This is very Benjamin, what you're saying now.
Yeah.
We're bound to get there in the end. Okay, so the gap, the unsayable that opens in the gap between languages is very important. And I go back to the native English speaker, they don't experience that. And I think that gap that you're describing, the gap between ways of speaking that are incommensurable, that you cannot match, that is a space of judgment. Because if you are translating in an ordinary practical circumstances, you have to say one way or say the other. then if you are translating, you have to make a decision to go this way or that, even though there's no rule to guide you.
Mm.
And that actually is like a lot of our lives, isn't it? Our moral lives are very often presenting us with situations where it would be nice if we had a clear-cut rule, but we don't. Or we have conflicting sets of rules. Should I try to fulfill myself through my career, or should I be loyal to my parents who don't want me to go away? There isn't any way of resolving that by any calculus. Okay, so the experience of judgment that you come through translation, I think, can be highly educative in multiple ways. And again, it's something that the Anglophone person doesn't experience.
And would you say that in conclusion of this whole class,
Yeah.
would you say probably translation and what the Kasan talks about, this sense of nostalgia in connection with translation, is a one way of responding to this anxiety inclusion, which becomes sort of dominant, especially in the contemporary political scenes? Translation,
Yes,
translation in a way of going beyond monolingualism is a kind of one way of, not an answer, but a
Constructive way.
Yes.
Yes, I do think that's right. Yes, yes. She actually, she never really defines nostalgia definitively, but, finally I should say. But at the end of the chapter on Odysseus, the first one, she draws a distinction that is there in the philosophical literature. Which I can't now find. Oh, here we go. So, Heimweh. And Sehnsucht, which is more like the sense of a lack, the sense of there's more that I'm trying to reach to. There's more that I'm trying to reach to. So this is like a kind of perfectionism. I aspire to something more. There's more to be understood than I've got here. As though there's always that space to be filled or that further possibility. So this one she describes as the return home as in Odysseus, idealized in the figure of Penelope and the marriage bed made from the tree that's rooted in the ground. Okay, so that's a very powerful image, but this one is more like this reaching always to something further. So there's a sense of longing there. Perhaps it connects with eros as well, a sense of longing for something more, which she sees as another facet of this nostalgia.
So
you see that?
The Kasan talks about
She talks about these two dimensions, which she says run through philosophy.
Excuse me, Paul.
Yes,
shall
we'll stop.
we take a break or shall we stop here?
I think we should probably stop, don't
Stop
you?
here.
Yes, yes.
So I
thank you.
think that this is the end of the course, and so we are now soon going to give a instruction for the final report. But first of all, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.